So the topic of today's talk is children born of war, unintended consequences or intended outcome. And as Simon has mentioned, I have spent a lot of time researching children born of war, and normally what I do look at is specifically the impact on children born of war as they grow up, childhood adversities, but also in adulthood. Today I want to take a slightly different approach, and I want to look at why are they born, how are they conceived, why are they conceived, are they really unintended consequences, as we have long believed, of consensual or exploitative or coercive relationships in war, or is there a case to be made for there possibly being a strategy to children born of war being conceived? Those of you who were here last week heard Matt Holbrook talk in his talk on or about May 17th, very much about cultural history and the specificities of time and space. And it struck me while he was talking last week, and I was already trying to think about this week's talk, that you can hardly imagine a more different approach, because Matt really zoomed in on individual spaces and times, and what I want to do is I want to almost ignore space and time and look at 3 case studies across time and space to see whether I can detect any patterns. So are children born of war unintended consequences of random or patterned but unintentional and unstrategic soldiers' behavior, or is there actually a pattern to this? And what I want to do is I want to look at 3 specific case studies. Now, we're probably all familiar with the idea of war being an accelerator of events and developments and trends. And I want to look more at war maybe as an accelerator, as an amplifier of trends and developments. In a recent paper on sexuality and the nation state, a sociologist asserts, quote, "Understanding sexuality as the natural source of human life and social renewal, government officials everywhere have made it a principal target in their efforts to know, manage and control national populations, linchpin of modernity in Foucault's terms, in the nation-building project." Now, if nation-states are concerned about sustainability and strength in peacetime, I guess the question is, wouldn't they be even more concerned about it in wartime, when the threat to extermination is a lot more immediate and imminent? And if we think about some of the more recent pictures we've seen in the news of, say, the Chibok girls being released and returning home after captivity, or Yazidi women returning home after captivity, many of whom pregnant and with children, one wonders whether there is more to it than gender-based violence as a random act. So what I want to do is I want to investigate policies and discourses leading up to soldiers having intimate relations with civilian populations who they come in contact with. What I don't want to do, and I should say this as a word of warning for all those who are more interested in theory and methodology, I'm not going to look at the theoretical Überbau of conflict-related sexual violence, of which there is a massive body, but I'll just ignore that for today. What I will tackle is the rationale for the kinds of actions, the consequences of which we see in children born of war. So a few remarks by way of a preface. We are familiar with the concept of women as the bearers of the nation, as it were. And we are also familiar with the fact that militaries and governments on occasion are concerned about their soldiers having intimate relations with local populations, civilian populations. But by and large, those concerns are with sexual hygiene, and in particular with the fighting force of the armies rather than anything else. And if at all, if you look at the pictures here, it's really the sexual hygiene aspect that is predominant. The secondary aspect, also occasionally visible in information leaflets passed around military barracks at time of war, is the aspect of espionage, because that, of course, is also a danger of intimacy between soldiers and local populations. What we historically, traditionally do not see is any concern with the women involved, because that really doesn't matter so much. And we also don't see very much of a concern with the offspring that might come out of these intimate relations. It is well established, though, that in some conflicts, militaries and governments tacitly accept at the very least, but sometimes also welcome, that intimate relations between soldiers and civilian populations have the result of children being born. Probably the best known example of this is the incidence of mass rape of German and Austrian women in the final stages of the Second World War in Europe and the immediate after post-war period. But while we know that children born out of these relationships feature in some small way in the inner Soviet discourses at the time, we do not really know very much about the strategy behind this, and I suspect we won't actually find out. On the other hand, we do know that national discourses almost everywhere impose on women the roles of natural reproducers of the nation. And that accounts for the vulnerability of women in conflict because it exposes them to gender-based violence. Often this is seen, though, as gender-based violence to limit the ability of the enemy to procreate, rather than a particular concern of the army itself to possibly, by creating children, swelling its own ranks. Now, the three examples I want to look at today are the Second World War, and in particular the Lebensborn organization in Nazi Germany. The second case I want to look at briefly is former Yugoslavia, the war in former Yugoslavia, or wars, I should say, and in particular the Bosnian War. And thirdly, the LRA conflict in northern Uganda. And you'll see from these three conflicts they do not share very much, other than all three of them being 20th century conflicts, but that's about it. Now, what do these conflicts have in common if we look a bit more closely? All three conflicts have in common that children have been born as a result of these wars, children fathered by soldiers and born to local mothers. And all three conflicts also have in common that the militaries and governments in the background of these conflicts formulated distinct views on the potential role of children fathered by their armed forces. And I would like to interrogate these discourses before and during the conflicts that accompanied this conversation about national rebirth in most cases. Now, in all three conflicts, nationalism and ethnicity played a significant role in the justification of the conflicts in the first place. And it was really a conversation about the creation of a new generation of members of a certain ethnicity, nationality, or followers of a particular ideology, be it national, ethnic, or tribal, that featured prominently in the population policies. The way this panned out was very different. In the case of the Lebensborn, by and large, we are talking about consensual, if at times exploitative relationships. In the case of former Yugoslavia and the Lord Resistance Army, the LRA conflict, we are talking about gender-based violence of the most brutal kind. Now let's look at the Lebensborn to start with. And what I want to do is say a little bit about the conversation about racial purity and procreation that we are probably mostly familiar with in Nazi Germany. The Third Reich is probably the one regime that is most readily associated with near total control of all spheres of life, including the private and intimate sphere. And generally the wants and needs and rights and responsibilities of the individual were subordinated to the greater good of the German folk and racial purity in a way that is hardly known elsewhere. So it was very much a question of almost complete submission of the body and soul of the individual to the racial ideology of National Socialism. The policies devised to creating this racially pure folk and this Aryan society are well familiar. They included provision for the unborn child if it had the right racial qualities. It also included generally large-scale eugenics, both positive and negative. So what the National Socialists intended to do was, on the one hand, limiting procreation of those who were regarded as racially undesirable, and if I use these terms, please regard them as being in air quotes every time I do use them. So supposedly racially undesirable people were meant to be limited in their procreation, but the racial upgrading and the Nordification of the Aryan race was strongly encouraged. So higher birth rates among the people who were deemed racially valuable were strongly encouraged. Now, the obsession with this population growth, and both quantitative and qualitative, is well known. We are familiar with some of the policies, such as the honor cross of the German mother for particularly numerous families, improvements in welfare provision, and I don't really want to say very much about this. Most of these policies were very much within the nuclear family. But if the National Socialists were really successful in their procreation, then they really ought to also tap into untapped potential of single mothers. And in particular, of course, also of the specifically and particularly valuable, racially valuable part of the German population, namely the SS. And the organization that was tasked with implementing these policies was the Lebensborn. Now, the Lebensborn was founded in the mid-1930s by Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler himself. And the idea of this organization, and you can see some photos of the organization in action, some children born in Lebensborn homes and looked after as toddlers, and looked after as babies as well. And the photo on the top right-hand side is a lady who is a Lebensborn child with a photo of her father looking after her. The core ideas of this organization was to support racially, biologically, and hereditarily valuable families, all in air quotes, of course, with many children, but also to support pregnant women, of whom it was expected that they would bear children of such racial qualities. And, if necessary, to care for these children, for instance, if it was children of single mothers, by adoption into childless SS families. As such, the Lebensborn was very clearly an instrument of racial ideology and implementation of racial policy. And it was increasingly active. Several Lebensborn homes to support women in this way. Maternity homes were founded, and thousands of children were born within Germany. As war started and war went on, and areas were occupied that were deemed of racial value, the Lebensborn extended its activities beyond the German heartland. And in particular, if we think about the idea of Nordification, Norway was, of course, the primary battleground that the Lebensborn identified. Now, when the occupation of Norway started, military and policymakers in Germany expected large numbers of illegitimate children to be born in Norway and fathered by Wehrmacht, members of the Wehrmacht, military police, and the SS. And of course, very few of those soldiers would have married the local women. And that would have meant that this racially valuable stock would have been, would no longer be available to Germany to Germany for exploitation. Therefore, the idea was for Lebensborn to become a lot more active in Norway, and within a few weeks of the beginning of the occupation, the first Lebensborn home in Norway was established, and by the end of the war, there were 9 Lebensborn homes, and the number of children born in Norway actually exceeded the number of children born in Germany. And to put it into context, of course, Germany is not as doesn't have as large a population, and of course, the Lebensborn organization in Germany was only active from 1941 onwards. So the proportion of children born in the Lebensborn homes was much higher in Norway compared with Germany. Though not as pronounced as in Norway, in the other occupied countries in the West, the Lebensborn was also active, and the military and the civilian government in Germany was also concerned about those territories, and in particular the Netherlands, but also France, Belgium, and the Channel Islands. There was an awareness that many children would be born as a result of the occupation of those territories, and interestingly enough, as early as 1941, the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht suggested that mothers and their children, if the children were fathered by German Wehrmacht, members of the German Wehrmacht or the SS, should be given an opportunity to claim alimony. Now, this might not strike you as particularly noteworthy, but this is actually unheard of. Militaries do not take responsibility for illegitimate children of their soldiers. It does not happen. It still does not happen. And this is really very significant. This was, of course, not a particularly enlightened form of welfare policy, because this particular policy would only be beneficial to those of the appropriate racial stock. And it was interesting because Hitler very quickly ruled that from the racial point of view, he wasn't interested in France. He also wasn't interested in Belgium particularly. The only countries he really was interested in was Norway, which had its own provisions anyway, and the Netherlands. So the outcome of these internal policies was the decree about the care of children of members of the German Wehrmacht in the occupied territories in Norway and the Netherlands. And this was aimed only at the preservation and promotion of racially valuable Germanic heritage. In the other occupied territories in the West, France in particular, but also Belgium and the Channel Islands, there was some concern about the children there. Concern not in the sense that the Germans were particularly worried about their welfare, but it was really a question at that stage by the mid-1940s, well, by 1942, 1943, about replenishing the German population, because the war was beginning to get costly. By May 1942, the estimate was that about 50,000 children had been fathered by German Wehrmacht soldiers and born to French mothers. By October 1943, the number was estimated to be about 85,000, and that's a lot of children. So the French the Germans were very keen to repatriate those children to Germany, at least as long as they were healthy and looked German. And this is exactly what happened to a large number of them. The Lebensborn was supposed to be involved in all of this, and the Lebensborn home was conceptualized, but then war took over and overtook events effectively, and by 1944, when the Lebensborn home was ready to go live, as it were, the Germans were not in a position to impose anything anymore. The flip side of this racially motivated population policy relating to Wehrmacht soldiers of supposedly racial value was, of course, what would happen to those children who were not of that kind of racial value, specifically children born in Eastern Europe. There was concern about these too, but it was rather, well, shall we say, more differentiated. Now, Field Marshal von Braunitsch had urged, in view of the fact that the Germans were likely to be engaged in Eastern Europe for a very long time and were likely to be there in large numbers and were likely to have plenty of encounters with the local population, that the sexual needs of the soldiers ought to be addressed in a way that A, minimized any sexually transmitted diseases, B, minimize the risk of exposure to espionage, and C, in particular, with view to the Eastern Front, the potential reputational damage that would come from Aryan soldiers engaging with Slavic stock. Now, how would one deal with this? As many of you will know, the primary policy was Wehrmacht-sanctioned brothels, but it became clear very quickly that there weren't enough of them to be anywhere near a situation where the three objectives that Braunitsch formulated could be achieved. And the result, as the Wehrmacht thought, would be hundreds of thousands of mixed-race children. And even though the numbers that were floated were hugely exaggerated, it meant that policies were being devised. And these policies effectively were attempts at squaring a circle, because you would end up with large numbers of racially undesirable children. On the other hand, you would want to repatriate as many as possible because you wanted population growth. And the result was, in fact, a highly contradictory policy that, on the one hand, led to forced abortion and sterilization, on the other hand, repatriation of some of the mixed-race children. And what is interesting in our context here is that the children were measured really in terms of their usefulness to the fatherland through their racial parentage. And this was basically determined by how they looked. So if the Germanic features were dominant, they were deemed German, and the paternal bloodline was dominant. If they looked Slavic, then their fate was sealed and they would stay where they are. And quite often it meant the death of children. So this is what we saw in Nazi Germany. The second case study I want to look at are the Yugoslav wars. And if we thought Germany was bad, Yugoslavia is not going to make much more pleasant reading. I don't want to go into the details of the war in Yugoslavia, and I want to look specifically at the Bosnian conflict. Now, this is just to remind you a map of the area of former Yugoslavia. The three areas I will refer to are Serbia in pink, then this little area about in the southern tip, Kosovo, and then Bosnia and Herzegovina in green. Now, at first sight, the Second World War and the Yugoslav conflicts have very little in common. The first one was a global war. The second one was a regional conflict, and many people were arguing whether or not it was a war or whether it was a civil war. But both conflicts gained notoriety for two reasons primarily. First of all, because of the genocidal character in the or aspects in the ideologies that drove some of the aggressors and perpetrators. But secondly, also, as a result of the extreme violence and outright brutality, not just when encountering the enemy in the conflict, but also when encountering civilian populations. And what came to define the Yugoslav wars were massacres on the one hand and the rape camps on the other hand. Now, unlike earlier conflicts, the conflict-related sexual violence in the Yugoslav wars, in particular in the Bosnian War, were not hidden. They were out there in plain sight and were reported almost immediately. As early as 1992, and that's when the war actually started in Bosnia, journalists reported and started speculating whether the gender-based violence that was observed there was in fact just a random act of out-of-control soldiers outside the command structures, or whether it was actually something even more serious, namely part of a systematic campaign of ethnic cleansing. And is this second interpretation really that was identified as being the more accurate explanation? Pretty quickly, various organizations took stock almost immediately and led to the conclusion, in the words of UN Security Council Resolution 820 of 1993, that the atrocities were a massive, organized and systematic detention and rape of women, and the International War Crimes Tribunal later confirmed that it was a systematic attempt at ethnic cleansing, and they were genocidal. These atrocities were genocidal in character. Now the question is, how did the Serbs arrive at this point? And this is where we see some interesting similarities in the discourse between some of the arguments we heard underlying the population policies of the National Socialists and what we will see about Serbia and Serbian policies. Now what I ought to stress is that all sides in the Yugoslav wars committed atrocities, all sides committed conflict-related sexual violence, but the vast majority of atrocities were perpetrated by Serb soldiers, both regular and irregular, and the victims were in large number Muslim women. In this particular case, the main objective was the humiliation of the women and the destruction of the victim's identity, but there was more to it than that. And in order to understand that, we need to look a little bit at the pre-war discourse in Serbia. Now, the rape of women was understood as an attack on the heart and soul of the religious and social structures of this particular victim community. And that's nowhere more evident than in the strategy document that was drafted and was designed to inform Serb policies outside Serbia when the conflict was building up, the so-called RAM plan, a military strategic plan for the creation of a greater Serbia. Now, this was drafted by the Yugoslav People's Army, together with experts from the Army Psychological Operations Department. Now, that in itself is quite interesting. Why would this Psychological Operations Department be involved? And when we hear their analysis, it probably is no longer surprising, because according to their analysis, and they are talking about the interactions between Serbs and potential adversarial communities, the morale, will, and bellicose nature of these groups, Bosnians, Muslims, Kosovo Albanians, can be undermined only if we aim our actions at the point where the religious and social structure is most fragile. And where was it most fragile, according to this particular strategic plan? It was at its most fragile with women, especially adolescent, and children. Further, it was assumed that, quote, decisive intervention on these social figures would spread confusion among the community, thus causing first of all fear and then panic, leading to probable retreat from the territories involved in war activity. In other words, it was a very deliberate attack on predominantly young women and children as a deliberate act aiming to destroy the military potential of the enemy. Now, what was underlying all of this? Amongst others, it was a deep-rooted concern of the Serb nationalists with demographics. And again, that sounds not that unfamiliar if we think about the underlying discourses we heard in Nazi Germany. So not unlike the preoccupation with birth rates and the threat to the national cohesion and integrity because of demographic developments, in Serbia too, there was a deep-seated concern about where the population was going in terms of growth, quantity, and quality. And the reaction to this was, again, not dissimilar to what we saw in Nazi Germany, an increasing significance of the cult of motherhood. We find return to more traditional values of patriarchal society, emphasis on female domesticity, going hand in hand with increasing authoritarianism and also nationalism, contested but nationalism. The way this was framed was very often by saying the Serbs were threatened by genocide on the part of other nations, because other nations replenished much more quickly. And this is really where Kosovo Albanians came into the fore in the discourse most prominently. The Albanians had the highest birth rate in Europe, and an area that was traditionally a Serb stronghold increasingly became overtaken, in inverted commas, by Albanians. And the conversation around the discrepancy in birth rates and the Albanians becoming much more numerous in this particular area, these conversations were largely had in terms of genocide and the pressure on Serbs in Kosovo being a result of these genocidal activities on the part of Kosovo Albanians, i.e. they were repopulating much more quickly than the Serbs themselves were. In the 1980s, in Serbia more generally, we see a much more pro-natalist policy in response to what they termed the White Plague or the White Death. And again, the policies don't sound that unfamiliar. Imposition of taxes for unmarried men and women. There was an attempt to deal with anybody anybody refusing to accept matrimonial duties in terms of treating them like traitors. There was a very strong collaboration between the political and the religious sphere. And this is very interesting if one looks at the rhetoric here too. The most obvious example for this is probably the abortion debate. Now, abortion was legal in Yugoslavia at the time. It had been legal since the Yugoslav Constitution of 1974. And the conversations at the time were joined by the Bishop of Tuzla and Zvornik, and it was argued at the time that abortion should be banned for 3 reasons. Now, it's important to consider the order of those 3 reasons, bearing in mind this is the bishop. The 3 reasons were A, its contribution to the mass dying out of the Serbian nation; 2, the fourth commandment, i.e. thou shalt not kill; and 3rd, God's commandment to go forth and multiply. So the bishops argued very much along the lines of a nationalist discourse. The image invoked in this discourse, in particular, was that of a medieval heroine of the Battle of Kosovo, called Yugoslavia, the mother of 9 who had sacrificed all her 9 sons in that battle. And this woman was actually the image that would dominate the Serbian equivalent of the honor cross of the mother. The Mother Jugovic medal was awarded for mothers who had more than 4 children. So again, we see certain similarities between Nazi Germany and the Serbs. When the first armed clashes occurred in the early 1990s, women were not only tasked to replenish the nation with young men that could take up arms, but they were also asked specifically to sacrifice these young sons. The tone of the debate and the resulting policies became ever more adversarial. And perhaps the most obvious example here is a document called Warning on the Demographic Movements of the Serbian Population from 1992, which stated, without offspring there's no family, without kin there's no nation. And again, the organizations that had joined forces to create this document are quite interesting. It was the Socialist Party of Serbia, perhaps to be expected, the Serbian Orthodox Church, after what I've just said about the Bishop of Tuzla, perhaps also not particularly surprising, but also the Serbian Academy of Arts and Science, the Serbian Medical Association, and the State Bureau of Statistics. becomes increasingly openly pro-natalist, the discourse. But what we then also find is, as the war progresses, increasing elements of gender-based violence leading to the rape camps that we all know about. When the atrocities, the gender-based violence was investigated during the war and after the war, what became noticeable was that this violence was not just aimed at destroying the reproductive capacity of the enemy, but some of the rape camps, shockingly, were not just rape camps, but they were also, I guess, what one would call procreation camps, because not only were women assaulted, they were also forcibly impregnated, and in addition to that, they were kept captive until it was too late for abortions. And it became clear in the investigations after the war that there was a very deliberate policy of using those rape camps to forcibly create the next generation of soldiers for the Serbian army. Now, however ludicrous that might sound, this was actually a reality, and this was the implementation of the pro-natalist, procreationalist discourse that we had previously seen among the Serbs. It's a very clear reproductive aspect of gender-based violence that we saw in Serbia. We saw it on a relatively small scale, because many of the women didn't survive the experience, and therefore many of the children didn't survive the experience. And once children were born, many women left the children, or there was also sadly a very high incidence of infanticide. Let's move to the final conflict, and I'm really trying to report some of the work that Alan did, but also some of our other students here at Birmingham, Eunice Arpio, Elizabeth Bramley, looking at what happened in the LRA conflict, because again, here we have interesting similarities in the discourse. Now, just very briefly, for those of you, I know there are many in the room who are very familiar with this conflict, but some of you might not be. This is another conflict where we encounter gender-based violence on a large scale. The conflict in itself, just briefly, after 3 decades of conflict following, or 2.5 decades following Uganda's independence from Britain in 1962, organizations, rebel groups emerge in the mid-80s that tried to proclaim the need of a national rebirth or a regional rebirth in the northern area of Uganda. Now, the reason why those 3 decades were marked by conflict and armed struggle was that there was a strong correlation between ethnicity and opportunity. And we have, a bit like a seesaw, different regional groups swapping power, and with each armed uprising and each putsch we find, there's a different regional group becoming more powerful, and as they become powerful, they prosecute the groups, the regional tribal clan groups that had been deposed. And in the mid-1980s, there are large groups of dissatisfied, frustrated young men who come out of these armed struggles and ethnic cleansing, experiences of ethnic cleansing, and they find the rhetoric that comes out of these rebel groups and the spirituality that's proclaimed in these rebel groups quite appealing. And the most prominent of these groups is the so-called Lord Resistance Army, created by Joseph Coyne. He started to mobilize his followers in 1986 to join the military struggle for the rebirth of the Acholi people in the north of Uganda. And this organization, the LRA, soon became the leading rebel group, and it promised both security and spiritual cleansing, and it fought primarily initially against government troops and proclaimed that it would protect the local Acholi population from the dangers of the Ugandan government forces. When voluntary recruitment started to dry up in the late 1980s, early 1990s, the group resorted to large-scale abductions. And what we find is that not just young men who were strong fighters were abducted, but also increasingly large numbers of women. And they were recruited partly as porters, as cooks, as carriers, but they were also recruited as sex slaves. And I want to say a little bit more about this, but also about the rhetoric that surrounded this kind of recruitment and also the policies that were later enacted. And in order to understand this, there are 2 or 3 things one needs to say. The warfare initially was very much bush warfare with an almost nomadic existence of the LRA. Increasingly, from the mid-1990s onwards, the LRA established camp life in South Sudan. And when they started establishing camp lives around the same time as the forced recruitment started, the character of life within the LRA became slightly more, shall we say, domesticated, because there was a camp and one could actually have something resembling a family life or almost like a village structure. Now, the spirituality is quite important to understand what's going on. The LRA, Lord Resistance Army, the name itself actually explains what the organization is about. It's an army, so it's a military outfit. It calls itself Lord's Resistance Army. It means there's sort of heterodox Christian doctrine underlying it, and it's a resistance outfit, so they are resisting the government, local government. The spirituality is all about the creation of new Acholi, replacement of the old Acholi, replacement with the new Acholi, the spiritually guided, genuine new Acholi. In order to convince the recruits, the forced recruits, let's remind ourselves that many of them didn't do this voluntarily, especially later on. In order to bind them to the LRA, the recruits had to go through some rather grueling initiation rites, which had the dual purpose of especially cutting them off from the old Acholi, because some of these initiation rites included killing a family, witnessing atrocities, to name just the most horrid examples. So by essentially rejecting the old normative framework of their old communities and being initiated into the new set of norms, there was a distinction made between life in the LRA and the old life that they were used to. Now, the element I want to specifically look at in our context is the rules and regulations and ideas around sexuality, because there was also an attempt of physically recreating the new Acholi by forced procreation. Now, all sexuality within the LRA context was only allowed within the sanctioned framework. And sanctioned framework means it had to be approved, so to speak, by the spirits. Now, the spirit medium was, among others, Joseph Coyne, and he was obsessed by spirits, and therefore he was the one who could communicate the will of the spirits. And in particular, he communicated that women could be given to commanders as forced wives. And he also, through him, the spirits communicated under which conditions and how and when couples were allowed to procreate. And this is interesting in the sense that not only were couples prearranged, so women were given to men, they were also told when or when not to be intimate. And like the Nazis before them, the LRA was concerned both with quantity and quality of its offspring. Now, initially, of course, during the real hot phase of bush warfare, before there was camp life, fertility was very low. In the late 1990s, Coyne, or the spirits through Coyne, communicated that there ought to be a change in policy. And ex-combatants recall a particular meeting in 1999, which was later called the so-called opening of the wombs, because on that particular occasion, Coyne instructed men and women that it was time to procreate, and the spirit had sanctioned this, and from then onwards, couples were meant to have children, and they did have children. Within the regulated framework of the LRA, there was, interestingly, very extensive health screening. So couples were only allowed to have children when they were healthy. There was screening when they had to have children or were to have children. Notably, they had to space children to make sure that the children were healthy. And this was, by all accounts, a successful policy because the birth rates multiplied. What does all of this tell us? Another example of gender-based violence, forced conjugal association aimed at procreation. Do these examples tell us anything? Were they just random examples, or do they have anything in common in terms of the underlying ideas? Can we expect things to continue as they are, or can we expect this from all conflicts coming up now? What can we learn from all of this? It's difficult to find a common pattern per se between the conflicts, but it may be possible to think about the circumstances under which these procreative policies were devised. In particular, the kind of ethnic morality and the moral conditioning of the soldiers that was communicated to the soldiers as the conflicts were developing. Now, in all three conflicts, we have very much an ethnic conscience that was proclaimed by the whoever was in charge, whether it was a military government or whether it was a rebel force, and it was always formulated in terms of eliminating an external threat that was endangering the nation, the rejuvenated nation, the greater nation, the great Aryan nation, the greater Serbian nation, the new Acholi nation. A new order needed to be established, a new pure order needed to be established, and anything that threatened this new order, it was morally unobjectionable to destroy whatever was threatening this moral order. This meant that creating this feeling of moral obligation to make one's own behavior, including that of procreation, subject to the norms of this ethnic rebirth, was important, figuratively speaking and literally. What is also noticeable is that in all three examples where we have this ethnic discourse underlying, there's something that sociologists have talked about as runaway norms, conceptual frameworks of conflict-related behavior that disregards previously widely accepted cultural thresholds with regard to acceptable behavior. And we see that in Nazi Germany, we see it in Serbia, in the Yugoslavia, or in the Serb rhetoric in the wars in former Yugoslavia, and we also see it in northern Uganda. These runaway norms that mean there are no longer any safe spaces. And this absence of safe spaces is something that arguably is visible in many other contemporary conflicts, whether we look at Daesh, whether we look at northern Nigeria. Current conflict hotspots demonstrate that these safe spaces no longer exist. And on the basis of this, one has to fear that the project nation, as it were, that we see in many of the conflicts currently will continue to play an important role in international relations and globally appear to be going hand in hand with the simultaneous decline of the state and the rise of the nation. And that seems to suggest to me that children born of war, once seen as unintentional consequences of military conflict, may increasingly become the focal points of attempts at securing national rebirth as well. So I'll leave it at that.